I had lived in my quiet suburban neighborhood for years without issue, paying my homeowners association dues and generally keeping to myself. But everything changed when I decided to put up a simple wooden fence around my backyard for a bit of privacy. The HOA, notorious for its strict and often arbitrary enforcement of rules, sent me a letter within a week stating that my fence was non-compliant with the community guidelines. According to them, the fence was too tall by a few inches and the color wasn't an exact match to the pre-approved shade of brown they required. At first, I thought it was just a warning, something I could quickly fix, but then I saw the fine, $1,000 for a first offense, with an additional $100 accruing for every week the issue remained unresolved. That's when I realized this wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about power. I attended the next HOA meeting to reason with them, bringing along documentation showing that several other houses in the neighborhood had fences just like mine. I pointed out that I had followed the general guidelines and that the differences they were citing were so minor they were nearly invisible to the naked eye. However, I was met with cold indifference. The board members, a group of retirees who seemed to enjoy the tiny dictatorship they had built, dismissed my concerns outright. Rules are rules, one of them smugly told me, and if we let you slide, then what's stopping everyone else from doing the same? Their hypocrisy was blatant, and it became obvious that they had no intention of being reasonable. Frustration turned to defiance. If they wanted to play hardball over something as trivial as a fence, then I'd show them just how far I was willing to go. I wasn't just going to fight back, I was going to make a statement so grand that they would regret ever trying to strong-arm me. That night, I sat at my computer and began sketching out my new project. If they didn't want me to have a fence, then I would build something they couldn't possibly ignore. I would construct a castle wall, one that not only met their rules, but also exceeded them in the most absurdly legal way possible. I wasn't just going to comply, I was going to take their regulations and twist them into a masterpiece of spiteful compliance. The battle lines were drawn, and I was ready for war. Once I had resolved to build a castle wall instead of a simple fence, I knew I needed to be meticulous in my approach. The last thing I wanted was to give the HOA any legitimate reason to stop me. So, I spent the next few days poring over the community guidelines, studying every single clause related to fences, exterior structures, and property modifications. As expected, the rules were strict when it came to traditional fencing, maximum height limits, pre-approved materials, even specific shades of paint. But when it came to decorative structures and landscape features, things became much more flexible. Nowhere in the guidelines did it state that a homeowner couldn't have a perimeter wall if it was classified as a decorative enhancement rather than a fence. That was my loophole. If they didn't want a fence, I'd give them something far grander, something that technically met their requirements, but still defied the spirit of their overreaching control. With the rules on my side, I got to work designing my castle wall. I reached out to a contractor I knew, a friend from college who had done some impressive stonework projects in the past. After explaining my predicament, he was immediately on board, fascinated by the idea of using the HOA's own rules against them. Together, we mapped out a plan. I would build a 7-foot-high, solid stone perimeter wall, well within the legally permitted height for landscape structures. The materials would be premium, sourced from a local quarry to ensure durability and authenticity. The design would feature crenellations and subtle decorative touches, making it unmistakably castle-like, yet still falling within the aesthetic enhancements category that the HOA's regulations vaguely mentioned. Best of all, I would file all necessary permits and ensure that every step of the construction was entirely above board. If the HOA wanted a legal battle, they'd have to fight against their own rulebook. Once I had the plans in place, I submitted the paperwork to the HOA, knowing full well that their jaws would drop the moment they saw what I was planning. Sure enough, within a few days, I received a condescending letter from the board. They had seen my application and were concerned about how such a structure would harm the uniformity of the neighborhood. But to my delight, they couldn't outright deny my request. The rules simply didn't prohibit what I was doing. They tried to delay me, asking for additional documentation and questioning my choice of materials, but I had anticipated their pushback. I responded with precise, legally sound arguments, each one backed by their own guidelines. Their hands were tied. With no legitimate reason to reject my proposal, they begrudgingly gave me the green light. The moment I got the approval, I wasted no time. I hired my contractor, ordered the materials, and scheduled the construction. The HOA had declared war over a simple wooden fence. Now they were about to witness the rise of my castle wall. With all the necessary approvals in place, the real fun began. The first shipment of stone arrived early on a Monday morning, and within hours, my front yard was transformed into what looked like a medieval construction site. My contractor and his team wasted no time laying the foundation, carefully measuring and setting the base stones to ensure the structure would be both sturdy and aesthetically impressive. As the days went by, the wall slowly started to take shape, thick, towering, and undeniably regal. Neighbors would slow down as they drove past, craning their necks to get a better look at what was happening. Some of them, especially those who had also been victims of the HOA's nitpicking, gave me subtle nods of approval. Others, particularly the more HOA-friendly types, stared in horror. It didn't take long for the HOA to respond. By the second week of construction, I received a letter demanding that I halt all work immediately. According to them, the project was now under review for possible violations, despite the fact that they had already approved it. They cited concerns about neighborhood cohesion and property value depreciation, but their desperation was obvious. They weren't expecting me to actually go through with it. They had assumed I would back down when faced with their obstacles, not double down and build something that made every other house on the block look like a peasant's cottage. I, of course, ignored their letter. As far as I was concerned, they had already signed off on my plans. I had the paperwork to prove it, and there was nothing in their regulations that prohibited what I was doing. As construction continued, the HOA escalated their tactics. First, they sent a representative to my property, an older gentleman in a cheap suit who tried to reason with me. He stood in my driveway, shaking his head and speaking in a slow, patronizing tone. "Now, listen," he said, as if explaining basic arithmetic to a child. "This really isn't in the spirit of the community. Wouldn't you rather just take down the wall and replace it with a nice, approved fence?" I smiled, relishing the moment. "I tried that," I replied, "but you fined me for it." So, I decided to go with something more decorative. His face twitched. He knew he had no real authority to make me stop, and that infuriated him. When reasoning failed, they turned to intimidation. I started receiving letters warning me about potential fines for disruptive construction and failure to adhere to community standards. They even sent someone to take photos, presumably in an attempt to find some kind of violation they could use against me. But I had been careful. Every aspect of my project was in complete compliance with their guidelines. By the end of the third week, the wall was nearly complete. The thick stone perimeter wrapped around my property, complete with crenellations and decorative sconces that made it look straight out of a medieval fortress. At the main entrance, I installed a heavy wooden gate with iron reinforcements, just to drive the point home. The final touch was a custom-made plaque above the gate that read, in bold lettering, "Fort HOA Defiance." It was a masterpiece of legally sanctioned pettiness, and I couldn't have been prouder. The neighborhood had never seen anything like it, and neither had the HOA. Their carefully curated suburb was now home to a full-blown castle wall, and there wasn't a thing they could do about it, at least, not legally. But they weren't done fighting yet. Their next move would be their most aggressive attempt yet, and I was more than ready for it. The moment my castle wall was completed, the HOA went into full panic mode. What had started as a simple attempt to fine me for a fence had now escalated into their worst nightmare, an immovable, legally compliant fortress standing defiantly in the middle of their cookie-cutter neighborhood. The board members, who had previously acted smug and untouchable, were now scrambling to find a way to undo what they had allowed. Their first move was an emergency HOA meeting, where they attempted to pass a new bylaw that would specifically outlaw castle-like perimeter structures. But there was one major problem: they couldn't apply new rules retroactively. My wall had been built under the guidelines in place at the time, and no matter how much they twisted their logic, they couldn't legally force me to tear it down. The meeting ended in frustration, with the board members grumbling while several homeowners, many of whom had suffered from the HOA's heavy-handedness in the past, openly applauded my victory. Realizing they couldn't simply legislate my wall out of existence, the HOA tried a more underhanded approach. Over the next few weeks, I started receiving notices accusing me of various violations. One letter claimed that my construction had caused excessive noise complaints from neighbors. Another alleged that my property's unusual appearance was reducing local property values. The most ridiculous notice accused me of failing to maintain architectural harmony with the rest of the neighborhood, as if the row of nearly identical beige homes had ever been a masterpiece of design. But they had no real evidence, and I wasn't about to be bullied. Each time they sent a notice, I responded with a polite but firm rebuttal, attaching copies of the HOA's own rules and my approved permits. I made sure to CC my lawyer on every response, just to let them know I wasn't playing around. When paperwork and legal intimidation didn't work, the HOA resorted to outright sabotage. One morning, I woke up to find that someone had thrown paint over a section of my stone wall, defacing it in an apparent act of protest. I had security cameras installed by then, and while the footage didn't capture a clear face, it did show a suspicious figure creeping around my property in the middle of the night. I filed a police report and sent a copy of the footage to the HOA, demanding they take responsibility for the actions of their members. They, of course, denied any involvement, but their silence spoke volumes. I responded by repainting the affected section and adding an extra layer of sealant, making it even more resistant to vandalism. If they wanted to destroy my wall, they'd have to try a lot harder. As their frustration mounted, the HOA made one last, desperate attempt to take me down. They tried to sue me. They filed a lawsuit claiming that my wall violated the spirit of the HOA agreement and was causing irreparable harm to the neighborhood's aesthetic. It was a laughably weak case, and they knew it. But they were banking on the idea that I wouldn't want to deal with the hassle and legal fees. Unfortunately for them, I was more than ready to fight. My lawyer dismantled their arguments with ease, pointing out that not only was my wall fully compliant with their regulations, but I had also followed every legal requirement to the letter. The judge, clearly unimpressed with the HOA's baseless claims, dismissed the case almost immediately. To add insult to injury, the HOA was ordered to cover my legal fees, leaving them with a hefty bill for their pointless crusade. That was the final nail in the coffin. The HOA had thrown everything they had at me: fines, intimidation, sabotage, even a lawsuit, and they had lost at every turn. My castle wall stood strong, an unbreakable monument to defiance against their overreach. But the best part? My victory had set a precedent. Other homeowners, inspired by my success, started pushing back against the HOA's arbitrary rules. Some even began their own renovation projects, adding decorative structures and unique features that had previously been stifled by the board's iron grip. The HOA's power was crumbling, and they had no one to blame but themselves. But while the war was over, my battle wasn't quite finished yet. There was still one last move I had in store for them, the ultimate checkmate that would haunt them for years to come. With my castle wall standing tall and the HOA humiliated by their failed lawsuit, I could have simply enjoyed my victory and moved on. But after everything they had put me through, I wasn't content with just winning. I wanted to make sure they never tried anything like this again, not against me and not against anyone else in the neighborhood. So, I devised a final plan, one that would permanently shift the power dynamic and leave the HOA reeling for years to come. First, I dug into their finances. The lawsuit had already drained their legal budget, but I suspected their problems ran even deeper. Through public records and some conversations with other homeowners, I discovered that the HOA was mismanaging funds, charging excessive fines while neglecting basic community maintenance. Street repairs were overdue, common areas were falling into disrepair, and the HOA board had been increasing dues without clear justification. Armed with this information, I rallied a group of disgruntled homeowners who had also been mistreated by the board. Many of them had been fined for petty infractions, from mailbox colors to driveway cracks, and they were more than ready to fight back. Together, we formed a coalition to challenge the current leadership. Next, we launched a full-scale campaign to replace the HOA board. Since HOA elections were open to residents, we used every legal avenue available. We went door to door, gathering support from neighbors who were tired of the board's tyrannical rule. We exposed their financial mismanagement, shared stories of unjust fines, and highlighted how they had wasted money trying to fight a pointless battle against my castle wall. The momentum grew rapidly, and when election time came, we voted out nearly the entire board. The HOA's most vocal enforcers, the very people who had fined me for my fence and tried to sue me, were removed in a single night. In their place, we elected reasonable, homeowner-friendly members who actually listened to the community. With a new board in place, we immediately made sweeping changes. The arbitrary rules that had caused so much misery, including the ones about fence heights and pre-approved colors, were either rewritten or abolished entirely. We revised the fine system to ensure homeowners wouldn't be charged outrageous fees for minor infractions. We put new financial oversight policies in place, ensuring that HOA funds would be used for actual community improvements rather than legal battles and power trips. And, perhaps most satisfyingly, we passed a resolution ensuring that my castle wall and any other creative architectural projects could never be forcibly removed as long as they met basic safety standards. In the end, my battle with the HOA turned into something much bigger than just a fight over a fence. It became a symbol of resistance against overreach, a lesson in standing up for one's rights, and a reminder that the little guy doesn't always have to lose. My castle wall remained, not just as a personal victory, but as a monument to the homeowners who refused to be bullied. And every time I walked through my iron-reinforced gate, past the plaque that read Fort HOA Defiance, I couldn't help but smile. The HOA had tried to control me, but in the end, I had rewritten the rules and taken their kingdom for myself.